This time of year it needs to be pretty hot. I just temped it at 95 degrees Fahrenheit is where I got it set to before I started pouring it into our water bucket. If it's much colder than that, by the time I get to dough bin, the dough is really cold. It's cold outside, so the ground temperature is colder, the flour is colder to begin with. The fridges keep a lot better in the wintertime than they do in the summertime. So starting warm is really important if you think that you're going to be in an environment that's cooler than your fermentation environment ought to be. So if fermentation is kind of perfect at 84 degrees Fahrenheit, I think that's around 26 degrees Celsius, I'm currently at 72 degrees Fahrenheit according to my handy dandy thermometer over there. So the dough is going to naturally be cooling down to 72 if it can. Fermentation at 70 is quite literally half the rate at 80. So we really don't want to lose those 12 degrees. So I'm going to start all the way up at 95 degrees on water, and you'll see, I'll do some temperature checks along the way, and you'll see how it sort of vastly changes. So I have a bucket just like it on the scale, zeroed. So that means that when I put that bucket on the scale, the weight of the bucket isn't a factor, and we're only weighing the contents of the bucket. We need to get to a certain level of water, a little over 35 liters. I'm now going to weigh this warm water. Try not to get it to shake up in here, because then it starts to mess with the scale. So now what I need to do is take my value that I need, which is 36.7 liters, and then subtract the value that I see on my scale. And I'm quite literally halfway there, almost to the T. So I'm going to dump it right in the bowl. And then fill this bucket up one more time. We should end up pretty close. I need 18.38 liters left. So my temperature of the water is still holding nicely. And again, I need 18.3. I'm going to grab myself a 1 quart container from nearby, just in case I'm a little off. And I am off by exactly 1 liter. I have 19.3 here. Come out to the flour stack here. Pulling 2 of these guys out today. And then a third for the next mix. Each of these bags weighs 50 pounds. They have been pre-weighed, so we know that we have 50 pounds of flour in them. So since the last time that I mixed bread, I tweaked the process and added a step. So normally we would add flour to the water right now, spin it, and have an Autolyse. But we are taking away some of the water, so I tared this container, and I'm going to take away 1.8 liters. See how close I got. 1.4. The French like to call the technique that I'm prepping myself for bassinage, and I think it's because you have a little bath of water that you're creating, and you're going to give your dough a bath in it later on. Basically, you're going to bring this water into the dough later on as a means of hydrating the dough as opposed to hydrating the flour, if that makes any sense. Anyway, we complicate our life by adding another organic flour. It's called High Mountain from Central Milling to this particular formula. And so this is no longer quite the same bread that we were making before because of what amounts to less than 2 kilos of flour against another 45 or so. So this is 100 pounds of flour that's going to go into this mix, and I have this magic organic 2 kilos, and it makes enough of a difference that we are adding it to the flour. Again, sort of going into the science. And how do we know it makes a difference? Just through trial and error testing, teasing out variables, trying to decide how do we want our final bread to be? What do we want it to be like? And figuring out what flour composition gets us there. So for the first bag, I can easily just introduce the whole bag into the bowl. Right now the bowl is going counterclockwise. When the bowl is moving clockwise with the hook, which is also moving clockwise, the effect on the dough is a stretching of the gluten, which is exactly what we want to build dough strength. But in the beginning, when we're just putting flour into water, we just really want the flour to be absorbed. So notice how quickly this is just soup now. Whereas by the other method that we really were only mixing by before, the effect was probably 3 minutes later to get to this result. So shaving a few minutes here and there. I know that's a pretty simple thing, and I'm sure a lot of people would just think, oh, you should have known that. But you don't know what you don't know until you know it. So, you know, whatever. We know it now. With the second one, you got to be a little bit more careful because this bowl is getting pretty full. So I'm not going to add all of it at once. And I'm able to easily add it as it goes. And then the magic stuff, the organic flour. This is a really high protein flour that we're putting in, which is just giving us better dough strength overall. It's bringing up the overall protein level. Right now, my only aim is to incorporate the flour and the water together and then leave it alone. So it's going to remain kind of a shaggy mess for a little while and strengthen on its own. So I'm letting it go for a minute longer, and I'm going to scrape down the edges to kind of get it clean. Sometimes you might find some clumping flour and water on the edge of the bowl, and if you don't address it now, it can stay that way, meaning what happens like when flour and water interact where the water sort of envelopes the outside of the flour, but the inside, the flour is still stuck together and it's not quite hydrated. There's still some of that going on here in the middle, and I generally don't like that going into an Autolyse. It gives me the impression that I need to spin the bowl for another 30 seconds to a minute to work out some of those finer clumps. So I'm going to do that. I used to mix by hand every single batch of dough, and sometimes it's better just to fix something manually instead of watch it spin around in the same exact spot. Clearly the machine was not adequately getting it there. So the Autolyse is done now. The bowl is fairly clean, and it is warm, which is great. If you have cold dough in this particular moment in time, you should be a little bit worried, especially if it's not Phoenix in the summertime and you don't have the 120 to help you. Right now, the temperature of the dough is 88 degrees Fahrenheit. My ideal bulk fermentation temperature is 84. So consider that it's going to be sitting in this Autolyse now for 30 minutes in the 78-degree room. It's stable because there's a lot of dough and the mass is holding the temperature stable. It's in a pretty well insulated steel bowl as well, which is going to help it out. And there's a lot of it. So again, if you're working on something like this at home and you have a tiny batch that really only amounts to one loaf of bread, it's going to lose its temperature a lot faster than this giant bowl of dough will. And that's an important thing to note. So in a home environment where you can just move the bowl around, you would certainly want the bowl to be in a warm spot at this juncture. And so a lot of people are always asking me to translate what we do sort of down to the home baking level. I'd like to remind everybody that my home kitchen is right across the wall over there. So this really is the home baking level in a completely different context. But if we're talking about 1 or 2 loaves at a time, well, then find a warm spot on your counter for the Autolyse at this moment. Maybe it's somewhere near your stove. Maybe it's somewhere near a window. And we're gonna let this go now 30 minutes. In a commercial setting, we fill this 30 minutes of time with the next layer that we're working on. Where we started shaggy, now we are quite strong and developing a really nice dough strength. People ask all the time, like why the dough is so silky and smooth by the time we're working on the table in a few hours from this state. And it's because it really starts like that. And that has a lot to do with flour composition, protein levels. So as I mentioned earlier, we introduced this extra little bit of high protein flour from Central Milling called High Mountain. And that made a big difference in the overall strength of the dough, so now it's even more extensible. It's time to take the next step with this one. I know that I'm putting in basically this entire bucket of Harriet. So if you haven't met Harriet, here she is. She's a sourdough starter. This is a mature Harriet that has been fermenting now for a while, since earlier in the day today. She in this state is nice and bubbly and active. She is coming out of a refrigerator because we like to cool the starter down going into our mixes. I'm just doing a quick weight check to make sure that the amount in here is what I'm expecting, and it is, which means that I get to just simply dump it on top of the dough. So at this point, what do I have left to put in this dough? These 2 things, plus a third, which is salt. If you were ever wondering how much salt is contained in bread, this is the amount of salt in this 1 quart container that goes into 120 loaves of bread, each of which have about 15 slices. So you do the math on how much salt is in each slice. I think it actually amounts to under a gram, like a fraction of a gram per slice of bread. It seems like a lot of salt here, but remember it's going into 120 loaves of bread. So I have the salt, I have the starter, and I have the reserve water, which to a lot of people watching might be the most confusing, but that will be clear soon. So I'm going to put the starter right on top. People have all kinds of ways of incorporating the salt and all that. And I think that oftentimes these things get a little bit overcomplicated. Yes, the way in which you incorporate things matter. We're doing things very specifically, you know, the bassinage, all that. We're adding ingredients in a particular order, in a particular way, developing to particular levels, but there is a level at which we're getting a little too specific where it really doesn't make a difference. Like, I've gotten some remarks on, oh, we can't do what I'm about to do. A lot of people think I'm about to kill Harriet by putting salt directly on Harriet. I suppose this would be a bad thing to do to Harriet for any extended period of time, but I'm closing the mixer now and I'm spinning the bowl, and this will all be incorporated very soon in a matter of minutes. So I don't think that this is really going to make much of a substantial difference. I'm going to just carefully, I have this sort of negative space here within which to work. I'm careful not to touch the dough really. I'm just trying to clean up the edges of the bowl here. So it gave you the illusion for a moment that it was all smooth and incorporated together, but it was basically just like a sheet of gluten that was covering the top. And you can see that the sourdough starter is still not fully incorporated. And right now, incorporation is the key to this particular direction of the bowl. So I'm looking to see that the starter is incorporated, then I'm going to stop and turn the bowl around. Okay, so now you can pretty much tell there's really no more signs of just sourdough starter. And you can start seeing the sort of strands of gluten that are developing. Right now, a lot of them here are, I can see all the strands. So I look at this dough. Once we're at this level, we really need to be stretching them out and developing the strength slowly. So I'm going to change the direction of the bowl to kind of our default direction. Even though we've actually done so much work in sort of incorporation mode, the way that we started on the mixer was just in this direction because it's a safe way to develop slowly. So you get it going. So if you've looked at all in our croissant making videos and the way in which we develop a croissant dough, when you go to incorporate butter at the end of your mix as an emulsifier, so you're adding it to an already well-developed dough and sort of lubricating the dough that's already done, this is how Bassinage works as well. So we have a dough that's already well into its development. You can see where the hook is as it grabs dough. It's actually grabbing and stretching it, and those stretches are getting more robust with every turn. So now I'm going to take the advantage of this strong dough and trick it into accepting some more water. So I'm relaxing it actually in the time that I'm injecting water. So I'm going to throw some water on it. And sort of immediately weakened, but it's got a lot of strength, so it's going to work the water in slowly. It's sort of changing as we go and slowly accepting this new water, but I have a lot to go, so I'm going to bring this water in 3 different iterations. I'm going to let the dough accept this water. It's going to develop and strengthen, and then we're going to give it some more. So we're sort of gradually building up the dough with more water and more hydration without compromising its overall strength. So you actually see it sort of transforming in front of us as we go. Originally it was sort of like a bath that the dough was in. You could see the water sort of sloshing about. Now you don't see any more water, and now we're back to the gluten strand sort of pulling and stretching away, which is where we want to be. So that I'm going to let it build for maybe another 30 seconds to a minute, and then we're going to go again with we're going to hit it again with some more water. And the dough is just starting to take on a beautiful characteristic. As you take a closer look, you can see more definition with each pull of the dough hook. A lengthening in how strong and extensible it is. And this is sort of just going to max out on the table later on. So we're going to keep building its strength all the way to the point that we get to the table. After the mix, it's of course the stretching and folding in the bins that occurs. So here's number 2. I'm just leaving a little bit more for one more. So number 3 will follow. So this mix is done. There's really nothing else that I can do in the bowl that time can't get me. Is this fully developed gluten at this point? No. But would it pass a window pane test? Pretty dang close to it. And I can get the rest of the way in the bin through stretching and folding. Meanwhile, I know that this gluten still has an upward trajectory in its development. I don't want it to break down yet because it's not in its final form factor. I want it to be building strength. It's going to obviously be much smaller amounts in a loaf of bread that's shaped beautifully, going in the oven, holding its form factor for you when you eat it at the end of the day. So we need the gluten to be on sort of an upward strength building right now. We don't want to take it all the way in the mixer. I could not find any olive oil. It's going to use some vegetable oil. Very small amount. This is just so that the dough doesn't stick to the bins. Standard food brush. And there's so little oil that you don't even recognize that there's any oil in this bin at a glance. It's really just so that the dough doesn't stick. And now it's time to scale each of these to 12.8 kilos. That is the amount of dough that needs to come in these bins so that I get 16 loaves, which we use a 16-piece divider to divide them later on, and so that's why I'm scaling to 16s. That divider lets us make a lot more bread while gently handling it. And then from there we go back to using sort of the handmade process of folding the dough together. So it's this sort of nice hybrid between technology and handmade, trying to get to the most optimal finish. The dough has cooled down significantly since the last time that I measured its temperature, and I'm just very curious to get a new temperature reading. It is currently at 85 degrees. So it started at 88, and remember I told you 84 was the sort of target. So now I'm at 85 coming out of the bowl, and this is actually where you see the biggest decrease. So again, just trying to reiterate that if you don't start warm enough, you're going to end up in the winter with cold dough, and you'll be really upset 6 hours later when fermentation is at a crawl and you can't go to sleep because you refuse to put out bad bread. So temperature really matters. And in the winter time, accounting for the decline in temperature is super important. So now I'm just going to set these up on my fermentation rack, which I'll label these all at once I get it set up. So now I can just keep going. Now if you can sort of tell at the end, as I'm loading the spread, I'm sort of unwinding from it. You'd think that there wouldn't be much technique to unloading bread from a bowl, but it will stick to you hardcore if you really do it any other way. So that's my recommendation on how to limit the sticking. For all this dough that I've interacted with, it's pretty good as far as. Remember, this is like a 85% hydration bread. It's pretty high up there on the water content. It's pretty sticky. The way to deal with that is just that whole like unpeeling and peeling way of interacting with it. One of the ways that you can tell the quality of the mix too is just how clean it comes out of the bowl, frankly. If you end up with a ton of excess crap all over your bowl, flour, everything, clumps of stuff, and it's not coming out clean, it's not well developed, it's so the way that it kind of comes out and being able to sort of wash a giant bowl like this pretty easily because it's not all that dirty at the end is a sign that you're on the right track. And don't be ashamed if you're not there yet, because this stuff comes with time. We're going to go 3 sets of folds now, 30 minutes apart on these. And then soon thereafter, so we'll be ready to scale all of them. So my standard folding technique, there's a bunch of ways you can fold. People here disagree on folding techniques, but they really result in the same thing. If you're stretching the dough out fully and then folding it back on itself, I like to stretch it up and then let it fall back towards me and create these layers. And I really only stretch as far as the dough will allow me. Once the dough starts sort of resisting, then that's my cue to stop pushing it further. It tells you how far it needs to go. Very much helps to have an ability to keep your hands wet. And you can tease out problems, like I just found this clump that just had some undeveloped flour somehow. Probably the only one in its entire batch. But when you're folding by hand, you catch these type of things. Whereas like in a mechanized process that already would have become bread, you know, it's not, those things aren't going to come out. They're going to go all the way forward into your loaf. And you shouldn't stretch to the point that you're going to tear. The whole idea is building strength. If you tear at the gluten, you're actively degrading the strength. And it's a good thing to just note the time that you're folding so that you can figure out when the next 30-minute interval is. If you get a little bit too worked up on whatever you're working on and you don't look at the clock, you might not actually know what 30 minutes amounts to. You can set timers too. I used to work with timers, and oftentimes when you first start, it's probably one of the more effective ways to work, but I find it annoying to have something beeping at me all the time, as though as all of our phones and all that weren't enough of those beeps. So I try to just work on a good internal clock that matches the rhythm of the bakery, but it takes a while to get to that point all on your own. I'm going to put these bins back on the shelf. The dough, you can tell in the bins, is rising a little bit as time goes on. It's probably not very easy to see from your perspective, but from mine, it's quite noticeable. So I'm going to do the same thing I did before, but the dough will handle differently now than it did 30 minutes ago. It will be stronger and just fall into its new shape a little bit easier. The primary reasoning behind this is that I'm continually strengthening the gluten, but I'm doing so in its sort of ebbs and flows. So if I stretch this, you can see I'm stretching the gluten to the maximum resistance and then creating a doubling effect in the overall layers in the dough. And then it's held together with more layers. So I'm creating a multiplying effect now when I rotate it. And once again, I'm going to double the layers. Meanwhile, I've stretched it to max resistance and folded it over on itself. And so I'm just actively strengthening it, but I'm doing so in sort of the ebbs and flows. So by going through this round of folding for a minute for each of these bins, and then moving on to the next bin, now I'm giving all this dough that I've already folded a chance to relax. It's going to loosen that tension that it's holding over the next 30 minutes. And then again, boom, we'll hit it with another set of folds to tense it back up. And over time, this sort of tensioning and loosening leads to a stronger overall base mass of dough. So then when I go and divide it into the small individual loaves of bread, they actually hold their form, as opposed to the mass of dough just sort of you know, just having no strength and becoming a big puddle, it holds its form, and you'll see that when we get on the table a little bit later. Final round of folding now. This dough is really well developed. It's coming up in volume, starting to consume more and more real estate within the bin. I know that shaping hour is nearing as we get to this final fold. This is my one weird bin that doesn't have a full amount of dough in it. This mass has just gotten easier to handle over time. Okay, so next time I come back to each of these bins, I'll be dividing them into their individual loaves. If you're folding dough and every time you go back and fold it and it doesn't seem like it's getting any stronger, you might want to ask yourself, are you actually stretching the dough to strengthen it? Are you putting in enough of that stretch to create the tensioning effect? Because you should definitely be able to observe the point of your work here, and it shouldn't be hard. It is nice when there is a fold that happens not that far away from the time that you're dividing, that the dough divides clean when it's kind of recently tensioned, and more easily you get very even cuts, even pieces. So we'll start shaping in 30 minutes, and based on how the dough feels at that point, I might do a quick fold on some of the bins before I put them through the divider. So now we're going to introduce Amanda into the scene as my lovely assistant on the table. And we're going to start going through this bread. So I usually like to spread the dough a bit in here so that it's nice and even. And I take my table flour and sprinkle a little on top. This prevents the lid of the divider from sticking to the dough. Makes it clean. Helps to turn on the equipment. We lift it up. Hear that noise? Open, finish, and now I pull these away and pass them to Amanda to work on. Because we did a fold not that long ago, they are just coming apart in just very perfectly even segments, making our life a lot easier. So I'm going to drop the divider, and I'm already into bin 2. So she's doing her thing and starting to scale all of this and shape it into bread. We used to have to pre-round all these breads and added a bunch of like extra steps. The divider sort of does a lot of this extra work for us. So by the time I'm fidgeting around pre-rounding 30 loaves, that I'm already done shaping them in this case, so it's a lot more efficient. We have 180 to shape right now, and you know what, we're 2 minutes in. We'll see how long it takes the two of us to get through 180 loaves. It goes quite quick. So I'm creating a triangle here first by flipping the bread over, stitching, and then rolling it in on itself. The tuck and roll is often referred to. I'll try to break this down into a few more steps. So here I have the bread that has a slight dusting of flour. The side that is getting floured is going to end up on the table. It's going to be the side that's interacting directly with the table. I'm going to take one of these breads, I'm going to flip it over. Then I'm going to stretch the top and stretch the bottom corners away from one another into kind of this triangle type thing. Fold the top over, stretch it out, and this is called stitching. Left in, right over on an overlap. I'm going to do it again. left, in, right just overlaps here. Checking the overall shaping. Now I'm going to tuck in and roll, tuck in and roll, tuck in and roll. I'm using my thumbs, creating a nice base to push down and create tension. And so now I'm trying to basically tension the whole loaf together and create its final shape. So I'm tucking in those edges and then testing the overall strength of my resulting loaf. It should be nice and strong and hold up. So in a fast mode, it goes something more like this. As we shape all this bread, it's sort of important to consider that one of the reasons we are aiming for such a strong dough that's holding up, that, see, this dough is shaped and it's just holding its form. It's free form, just holding its shape. And it will be like that for a long time. It does a pretty good job. It's strong at this point. And the reason being is it's going to be in the oven all on its own. It's got to hold up for 30 minutes to what's happening in the oven. Plus all these forces of expansion are occurring. And when they do, we want the loaf to more or less still look like the shape that we put it in. So all of the dough development, all of the work, really, I mean, it's all 80% like fermentation and dough development. The bulk fermentation, the folding, the dough development in the mixer, that's where much of this work is going. And then, of course, there's the conceptual and intellectual side of the equation that we still haven't seen, because that's the teasing out and doing experiments every day with different types of formulas, different amounts of this flour, different amounts of that flour, creating the right dough strength to begin with through protein levels. So all of this is just science that amounts to the best possible bread that you can make at any given moment. In our case, this is it. It's a formula that now we've been more fine-tuning for a long time. In the past year, this particular formula did change with the introduction of the organic high mountain flour into it. And prior to that, the last change was when we added malted wheat. So we still keep changing this up, and it's all related to making sure that the final structure of these loaves is nice and strong so that it holds up to the bake in the oven. This one I didn't flour the tops, and you can see that the top sort of shredded a little bit, that very top layer. It will smooth back out on the table, but that's why you flour the top. It's right there. So this is the weird bin that didn't quite have enough for 16 loaves. So it's also a great opportunity to test my hand dividing skills and see how they have devolved since I last had to scale by hand on a regular basis. When you scale this way, it helps to pre-round the loaves right afterwards, create that same tension that the divider basically does when it pushes them out, and now in a few minutes they'll be ready for shaping like the others. But you can see that extra step in the time that it takes to divide 16 loaves in the divider. I'm going to only be a few loaves in doing this by hand. You can get very efficient, and this is not really an example of that crazy efficiency because I'm not doing this on a daily basis anymore. So I have this little extra piece of dough, and I'm just going to spread it out to a bunch of these. Since they all hit their weight, I'll quickly pre-round these. And we'll basically save these to shape at the end of all the rest of them that are on the table, giving them a chance to relax out of this pre-rounded shape. Once these are done, sourdough is done. This rack is already built and configured. It's going to go into the cooler when we're done here. The one neighboring will also go in the cooler when we're done. And that's just how it goes. Tomorrow morning, the next crew will show up and just immediately have the ability to bake off those breads that we're shaping right now. One of the things that we do is try to extend our fermentation since it's cold and things are moving a little slower. Once we put all this bread in the fridge, it's going to cool down pretty rapidly. We're watching the levels, and we have still scaled early for that cool down effect, because what happens is once I start dropping the temperature on all this bread, the rate of fermentation also drops, and it drops substantially. So once the refrigerator, which is at 41 degrees, takes hold and starts dropping the dough from mid-80s to the 70s, it's going to start slowing down. Then it'll get in the 60s, it'll slow down some more. And by the time it gets into the 50s, it's such a slow crawl that barely anything's happening. If we don't allow these loaves to sort of puff up to the level of proofing and fermentation we want before we cool them down during the winter, we will end up with under-fermented bread. So during this period of time, we're letting them stay out, and our coworker Dylan is going to eventually turn what we have as a proofer right now into a walk-in by switching off the heaters and turning on the cooler in there. And that'll give us a little extra space since our actual walk-in is completely fully loaded right now with other bread. And it's only Monday. Getting to the end of the 120 sourdough loaves and rounding out about 45 minutes of work to finish up this first set of bread. So as you can see, the overall shaping is not where the balance of time is going in terms of labor. Most of the balance of time really went into all the work leading up to this stage, which had taken us a number of hours in whole. Now we're going to find the stuff that we're going to bake. So I'm going to go back into the walk-in cooler and find it. Just moving things about at this point because I don't really want to take any more bread into the oven room than I need to. So there's a number of ways to do this. I prefer having like a sifter around, but I don't know where it is right now, so I'm just using my hand, and I'm going to spread the rice flour in to create a contrasting color. So when I score this bread, the white rice flour will remain lighter than the part that sort of blooms around it. It'll create a really beautiful coloring effect. I could probably do with a little bit more rice flour on a few of these. And I'm not compressing the bread as I interact with it at all. I'm, in fact, being careful not to. We can create a little bit of ornamental scoring that's super simple. Almost anybody can do this. I always start with the ornamental because the functional scoring is deeper, and so once you create that deeper scoring, the loaf is going to start sort of spreading out. So I'm going to do this sort of hairline ornamental scoring first and just do a simple wheat stalk. There you go. This is nothing like some of the work that you see people like Emerald doing, where the design is super advanced and requires true artistic ability, but this is still striking and not expected when you go to the store to buy bread. And it's sort of our minimum threshold on scoring. We expect anybody who works for us to be able to do this level of scoring. Now I gave that deeper functional score on a slight arc. Going from kind of middle to middle is what I like to aim for. So once you've done this a time or two, it's pretty easy to sort of fly through it. And again, the quality of the loam you're using makes a big difference. If you're into ornamental scoring and you want to incorporate this, well, the reason we do it is because we put so much effort into our dough formulations, into our technique of getting the dough to this state, into the whole lead-up process up until this point. And so we feel like adding that extra touch of the ornamental scoring allows us to more easily convey to our customers the amount of time that we spend caring about the inside of the loaf, which is harder to observe regardless of how it's finished. If you're going to make ornamental scoring a part of your bread baking experience, you should invest in a nice loam. It makes a meaningful difference in your ability to create striking loaves. One of those wasn't quite where I wanted it, so stuck my whole arm in the oven and moved it. That's what you do. Steam, 20 minutes. It took me 5 minutes to get that second deck loaded because my timer on deck 1 is 5 minutes ahead. All right, we still have some time here. So this is the first round of baking. 20 minutes with steam trapped, so we have the dampers closed on the ovens, trapping the steam. And so I'm waiting for the timer to expire on deck 1, which will happen in 4 minutes, and at that point I'll release all the steam from the chamber and let the crust develop on the loaf. So we have a few minutes in which to wait on these. Same kind of thing with this deck. We're just releasing the steam. We're taking a peek. Oh, this one we've got lights, so you can actually take a peek in here and see what's happening. These are beauties. Couldn't ask for more. The middle is not cresting over the ear, which just means fermentation levels are quite adequate. You can just, again, tell by the shape of the overall loaf how you did on fermentation. So pretty happy there. Again, I'm gonna set 9 minutes up so that I can kind of keep a watchful eye as we finish it up. Let's get the spread out. Oh, it's looking good. Beauties. Nothing wrong with that. So here we go. Let's start with the sourdough. I'm going to cut it straight in half, which is the least practical place to cut a loaf of bread, but it's the sexiest place to cut a loaf of bread. So you can take a look at the structure here. You can see nice and even fermentation sites throughout that have sort of evenness in size and spread. We don't really see any kind of dense clumps of anything different. Really happy with the result. We've got a nice ear, even fermentation, no large holes or shaping errors, and it's a really nice color overall. Got a great crust. It's still soft on the inside. You can tell. Really beautiful loaf of bread.